we'll see what we can delve into here. So here we go. Okay, so just as an introduction to the introduction, what happens is like this. The second book of the Torah, which is the book of Exodus, discusses the story of the slavery in Egypt, how the people were left Egypt, how they got the Torah. And then the last section of the book, I guess the last third of the book, discusses in great detail the commandment and how the Jewish people actually built the tabernacle, which was the temple that they built in a desert, which was portable. They would move it from place to place. And the end of the second book is describing how they finished building it, and there was a 7-day period of inauguration where Moses performs the service in the temple. Even though he was not a priest, his brother Aaron was the priest, but Moses performs the inauguration service in the temple for 7 days. And then that's the end of that's the end of the second book. Then you get to the third book. In the third book, the first two portions discuss specific laws of offerings. We have the temple. What do you do in the temple? Well, you offer offerings to God. How do you offer? Which offerings? Who offers? Why do we offer? That is the first two portions. Now we're getting back to the plot. What's the plot? It's the 8th day. The 8th day meaning after the 7-day period of inauguration, the 8th day. And as we will see, in the 8th day is the day that God was supposed to make his presence visible in the temple. In other words, now that's the day where God formally is going to dwell within the temple, and that's the 8th day. And that's where the name of our parsha, that's where our parsha gets its name. It's called Shmini, which is 8. It's the number 8. It's the 8th day after the 7-day inauguration period. It so happens to be that on the calendar, it was the 1st of Nisan. So we are now, Passover is always in the Hebrew month of Nisan. It's the first Hebrew month because we count months different than we count years. When we count years, we start from Rosh Hashanah. But when we count months, we start from the month of Passover. So the 8th day is really the 1st of Nisan. So why is it called the 8th day? Because it's the 8th day of the inauguration, as we will explain. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to share the screen, and we will read the portion in a nutshell, in short, and then we'll delve in. Okay, so it's Shmini. On the 8th day, following the 7 days of their inauguration, Aaron and his sons began to officiate as Kohanim, as priests. And then a fire issued forth from God to consume the offerings of the altar, and the divine presence comes to dwell in the sanctuary. So that's what we mentioned, is that you could see that, in other words, the divine presence is visible within the temple. So this was an amazing day. In some sense, it was the happiest day, one of the happiest days in Jewish history, because if you think about the state of mind of the Jewish people, they left Egypt, they got the Torah, but then they committed this terrible sin and this terrible betrayal by creating the golden calf. And God dwelling in the temple is symbolically God saying that he wants to, yet even though they sinned, he wants to remain in their midst. In other words, this is the reconciliation of the process of the betrayal of the sin of the golden calf. So the Jewish people are overjoyed. Now, so it's a very happy day, but unfortunately, there's also the tragedy, the famous tragedy of the death of 2 of Aaron's sons, which we're going to read about right now. Aaron's 2 elder sons, Nadav and Avihu, offer a strange fire before God, which he commanded them not. In other words, they take incense, they put it on the fire, they go into the temple, into the Holy of Holies, according to the sages. They go into the deepest part of the temple, most innermost, holiest part of the temple. They were not commanded to do so. And therefore, they die before God. So in this immense joy, we have this terrible tragedy. Aaron is silent in face of his tragedy, which is also interesting. He doesn't say anything. The verse says, Vayidom Aaron, he's silent. Maybe we'll discuss what that silence means. In any case, Moses and Aaron subsequently disagree as to a point of law regarding the offerings, but Moses concedes to Aaron that Aaron is in the right. So hopefully we'll have time to unpack this dispute between Moses and Aaron. It's not just a technicality. There's a great amount of meaning here. And we see the different perspectives of Moses and Aaron and how they looked at the world differently. And there's a lot to think about over there. Okay, now the second half of the parasha seems unrelated completely, but of course we have to find a connection. God commands the kosher laws, identifying the animal species permissible and forbidden for consumption. Land animals may be eaten only if they have split hooves and also chew their cud. Fish must have spins and scales. A list of non-kosher birds is given, and a list of kosher insects. There's 4 types of locusts. So it's very interesting. There are more kosher birds than non-kosher birds. And therefore, the Torah lists the non-kosher birds. It's short. The list is shorter. So for the birds, there's no sign. There's no kosher signs. For the mammals, there's a sign. For the fish, there are signs. For the birds, there are no signs, but the Torah actually lists the species. In any case, last paragraph, the final paragraph, also in Shemini are some of the laws of ritual purity, including the purifying power of the mikvah, a pool of water meeting specified qualifications, and the wellspring. So a wellspring is the natural mikvah. It's water coming straight from the earth. It's actually the highest level of purity. Thus, the people of Israel are enjoined to differentiate between the impure and the pure, and that's the concluding verse of this parsha. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the story in short. Have a nice day. No, I'm kidding. This is the parsha in a nutshell, and now we could start thinking about the details and what this all means. And most importantly is, of course, what this all means to us. Because when we study, it's not just studying the past, but it's very much connected to the present. Okay, so let's say l'chaim and warm up. And of course, mazel tov to Karina, because her son read the Torah this morning. It was beautiful and inspiring. So that was beautiful. So that was good.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's start with the number 8 for a moment. And because number 8 is a number, that's the name of the parsha. So you always have to at least address the name of the parsha. Number 8 is a very interesting number according to the Kabbalah and according to Judaism. So if you want to think about what number 8 is, you want to think about what is number 7. So number 7 represents the cycle of nature. Why is that? If you look, there's 7 days of the week. And why are there 7 days of the week? Well, according to the Kabbalah, it's because each day, one of the 7 divine attributes dominate in that day. So everybody has 7 emotional attributes, which reflect God's 7 emotional attributes. In other words, God expresses himself in 7 ways: through kindness, through judgment, through compassion, etc. And each day is one of those energies dominates. Now, so 7 is the natural cycle. And therefore, if you think about number 8 represents that which is even above nature. In other words, even above the holiness of within nature. So if you have nature, you have 6 days of the week are mundane. Then you have the 7th day is Shabbat, right? So Shabbat is holy, but it's holiness of nature. Then you have something that's even greater than Shabbat, number 8. And number 8 is actually greater than Shabbat. And I'll show you how you see it. You see it in a very interesting Jewish law, because Jewish law is not just technicality, but Jewish law represents spiritual ideas. So when you think about the number 8, what do we think of? Who knows 8? We just had Passover Seder, and some people sing the song at the end of the Seder. Chabad doesn't, but people sing Echad Mi Yodea. Who knows 1? Who knows 2? Who knows 8? So you think about 8. 8 is the circumcision. The Brit Milah is the 8th day. Now, we derive from a verse in this week's Parsha that the circumcision overrides Shabbat. In other words, usually Shabbat, you're not allowed to do work. And one of the forms and therefore a surgery or extracting blood would be a prohibition. Yet, on Shabbat, there's a specific verse that says, the 8th day overrides Shabbat. So if the child is born on Shabbat and therefore the 8th day is Shabbat, the circumcision overrides Shabbat. Why is that? Because number 8 is greater than number 7. And the circumcision, which is number 8, represents something that's greater than the nature, even than the holiness invested within nature. Okay. Now, when you get to the idea that God is going to dwell in the temple, what day is it going to be? It's not going to be in the 7 days, because the 7 days represent nature. The 8th day is the energy of God that's greater than nature. And that is what comes into the temple. That is what we're supposed to strive to bring into our life. We're supposed to bring the number 8 into our life. And that's what happens on this day, on the 1st of Nisan, which represents the day, the 8th day, which represents the day that the divine energy enters the Jewish people, enters the temple after all those months of building the temple. Of course, it's relevant to us because we also build a temple in our life, as we discussed many times metaphorically. But let's think about this for a second. If number 8 is much greater than 7, why is it called number 8? Number 8 has sort of a paradox, because number 8 means that it follows number 7. But if number 7 is natural, number 8 is not just one more. Number 8 is sort of a totally different category. And this is the idea here that the Kabbalah gives you. The idea here is that there are certain things that you could achieve on your own, and that's represented by number 7. Whatever you can achieve on your own is number 7. The things you cannot achieve on your own, you need God's blessing, is number 8. But you can't get number 8 before you try 7, before you put in your part. And therefore, number 8 is actually called 8. It follows 7, because you can't start with 8. You can't just say, God will help me, God will bring himself into my life, and things are going to happen. It doesn't work that way. First, you have to do 7, the 7 days of inauguration. In other words, first you put in the effort as much as you can. And after you put in the effort as much as you can, that's when God is going to bless your efforts. And that's when God will give you something that you could not achieve on your own, because it surpasses everything you can do.
Rabbi, yeah. Is that why the two sons, they were jumping the gun? They haven't done the 7 before they were trying to reach for the 8?
That could be. That could be. Yes, that could be. That could be. There's so many different interpretations of what's happening there. But yes, that is certainly one approach. When we get there, we'll try to unpack the various approaches. But absolutely. I just want to say one more thing to connect it with the times. We are now in an interesting time between Passover and Shavuot, the holiday of the Exodus and the holiday when we get to Torah. Now we know that there's a mitzvah that we count 49 days. 49 days from the second day of Passover until we get to Torah. That's preparation. 49 days is 7 weeks. Number 7, we prepare for the giving of the Torah 7 weeks, not 7 days, but 7 weeks. Then what happens? On the 50th day, 50 is like 8. It follows 7. On the 50th day, God gives us the Torah. But when does God give us the Torah? Only after we count the 7 days, 7 weeks. So after we do our part, God will bless our efforts. So there's a very interesting discrepancy when you talk about the mitzvah to count the Omer, which we're going to read about toward the end of the book of Leviticus. One verse says, count 7 weeks. Now, if you know math, even if you know any math, you know 7 weeks is 49 days. Another verse says, count 50 days. So the sages are left scratching their head. Which one is it? Are you counting 7 weeks, or are you counting 50 days? Are we counting 49 or counting 50? There's a paradox there. It's a contradiction. So the sages say exactly what I said. You're counting 49, and that's what we do. We don't count the 50th. We count 49 levels. But the 50th level, even though we don't count it, the Torah attributes, Torah in some sense says you're counting the 50th because you're only getting the 50th because you counted the 49. So I wouldn't say it's a partnership. It comes from God, but it can only come after we count our 49 days, which is like 7. 7 and 8, we prepare, and then God could be brought into our life. We can't bring God into our life. We can't do it. God is certainly not the level of godliness that supersedes nature. But if we do everything we can, then we can get to that level of 8, level of 50. So that's just an introduction addressing the name of the parasha, number 8, and why the significance of number 8, and a little bit of how we can apply that in our life, because in our life, we always have the 7 and the 8. The 7 is what we can achieve, and the 8 is awaiting God's blessing that surpasses anything we can achieve on our own. And the idea is we do our 7, God does his 8. God does the 8th. Okay, that's point number 1. Okay, so now I'm going to open the verses and we're going to read some Rashi and we're going to see here that there's a very interesting, so we're going to spend some time thinking about, you know what, let's start from the end. Let's start from the end. Instead of let's start big picture, then we go to the details. Let's start from the end. Okay, we'll start from the end. So this parsha really has 2 sections, as we saw in the nutshell. Maybe I could put it up again. The parsha really has 2 sections. The first 2 sections is talking about the 8th day. The first 2 paragraphs is the 8th day. The 8th day is God dwelling within the temple. And then we have the sub-story, which is what happened on that day, the tragedy of that day, and the response, the differing response of Moses and Aaron to the tragedy of that day. But it's all the 8th day. That's the first half of the parsha. Now, the second half of the parsha seems completely unrelated. In fact, I could have put this in any other parsha and nobody would have any problem. What? The laws of kosher, how to eat. How to eat, and not just how to eat kosher food, but also in biblical times, how to eat kosher food in a pure way. Because when they kept the laws of ritual purity, it was not important not just to keep yourself pure if you want to go to the temple, but if you want to go to the temple in Jerusalem, you also have to make sure the food you eat is pure. And there's many laws of how to keep the food pure and when food could become impure. I mean, ritually pure and ritually impure. And you got the second half, which is all about eating. Now, seemingly, this has nothing to do with the 8th day. It could have been in any other day. But spiritually and Kabbalistically, there are connections. And that's what I want to try to do right now before we get into the details and to the drama of the story of the 2 sons of Aaron. But let's see if we can connect the end of the parsha and the beginning of the parsha. What's the connection between God dwelling in the temple and the laws of eating? Okay, so I'm going to give 2 interpretations. And you tell me which one you like, or if you don't like either, that's fine too. And if you want to offer your own, is even better. So the first interpretation is fascinating. The first interpretation is that the sages say a very interesting statement. And it's actually perplexing. It's surprising. The sages say as follows, that in the times of the temple, the altar, Mizbeach, the altar would atone for the person. So if I committed a sin, as we read 2 weeks ago, and I want to bring a sin offering, I bring a sin offering. If I feel I want to come close to God, I bring an elevation offering. If I feel like I want to offer thanks to God, I bring a thanksgiving offering. But in general, the altar atones for the person. It has a spiritual effect on the person. What do we do now that we don't have a temple? So you can't go to the Temple Mountain and you can't offer the offerings. Without getting technical or political, every year on Passover, I open up the Israeli news and they say, oh, the Israeli police arrested people who are trying to offer the Passover offering on Temple Mountain. Terrible crime, because the Temple Mountain, they're afraid it's going to make political, political unrest. So the Israeli government doesn't like that people try to offer offerings on the Temple Mountain. The halacha is also the Jewish law is also not too excited about it, but that's another story. What I'm trying to say is now you can't offer an offering in the temple. So what do we do? What do we do for atonement? So the Talmud has a fascinating statement, a surprising statement. The Talmud says, Mizbeach, the altar, is like a table. So the Talmud says, now that we do not have an altar to atone for us, now that we don't have an altar in the temple, now the table of a person atones for him. In other words, it used to be you brought an animal, which is food, and you brought it to the table of God in the temple. And then some of it was consumed in the fire. Some of it the priests ate, and some of it the person who brought the offering ate. Now you don't have a temple, no problem. Your table in your house is your altar. That atones for you. Okay, it sounds very strange because bringing an offering is spiritual. It's a gift to God. How is it that me eating lunch, or eating breakfast, how is that atone for me? How is that connected to the altar in any way, shape, or form? So it's a very strange piece of Talmud, but according to the Kabbalah, it makes sense, because according to the Kabbalah, what the altar represents and really what the temple represents as a whole, it represents elevating the physical and making it more spiritual. So you're taking an animal, and when you bring an animal to the temple and you bring it to the altar, you're raising something from the physical and making it spiritual. And that's a metaphor, and that's sort of a symbol of what you should do in your life, that you bring yourself closer to God as well. So the Kabbalists say, what happens when you sit down to eat? You're doing the same thing. You're taking food, which is physical, and you're consuming it. You're making it into energy for the person. And then when you take that energy to do a mitzvah, to do something good, you're elevating the lower forms of life, be it a vegetable, be it a grain, be it an animal, be it a mineral, doesn't matter what it is. You are elevating it. If you're eating it properly, you're elevating it, you're transforming it into spiritual energy, using that energy to do good. You now are an altar. So what happened in the temple, in the desert, or in Jerusalem, now happens at your kitchen table. Right? The modern houses, it used to be that the most important room in the house was the dining room, the living room. Now it's the kitchen, right? Because people don't have formal dinners anymore. People sit in the kitchen. The kitchen is the big room in the house. That's what the modern houses are. So it's spiritually, it's a very true thing. Because spiritually, where does all the activity happen? Where are you becoming a temple? Where are you transforming the fuel? In other words, taking lower entities, physical entities that are not, and elevating them and using them for fuel to become spiritual. That's happening at your table. That's sort of the spiritual center of your house. And that's why the sages say that just like the altar used to atone for a person, now your food, the food if you eat, like they say in Yiddish, if you eat like a mensch, what you're doing is like a decent human being. In other words, not that the food is pulling you down, but you're elevating the food, then you are actually functioning as an altar. Now, now we understand the connection between this first half of the parsha and the second half of the parsha. The first half of the parsha talks about the inauguration of the temple, how God's presence comes into the temple. And what does the second half of the parsha talk about? What to eat for lunch, what fish to choose, what meat to choose. Why? Because eating is the same process as offerings. You are elevating the lower physical objects in the world and making it spiritual and making it feel for holiness. That is one interpretation of the connection between the first half of the parsha and the second. And if you don't like this one, I have one more for you. In the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, jokes, disagreements, it's all good. Okay, what's the second interpretation? For this, you have to be a little bit more, you have to sort of get a little bit more poetic here. And it's a Kabbalistic concept. The Kabbalistic concept goes like this. The Kabbalistic concept goes something like this. You have to look at the history. You have to go back to the first, to all the origin. You have to go back to the story of the tree of knowledge. What happens in the beginning of Genesis? God creates the world in 7 days, puts the human being in the Garden of Eden. You know the story, unfortunately. The person sins, the person is expelled from the Garden of Eden. Okay, so what, is that the end? No. The end is, eventually, where the goal is that the person, the humanity as a whole, recreate the Garden of Eden, but not in one specific location in the world, but transform the whole world into the Garden of Eden. That's the goal. That's the trajectory. That's where we're headed. And if you don't believe me that we're going to get there, you have to sign up for the upcoming JLI course, which is about the Messianic era in Judaism. So this is a plug for the JLI course starting soon. But in any case, I'm a rabbi. You always have to sell something. In any case, what's happening here is that we start out the Garden of Eden. We were expelled from the Garden of Eden. And the reason why we were expelled is because we failed. Why did we fail? Because it was gifted to us. And we didn't create it on our own. If we don't create it on our own, we don't value it. So now, over the last 6,000 years of history, our job is to recreate the Garden of Eden, but not, like I said, not in one location in the entire world. Okay. So the Kabbalists say, in some sense, you have to start somewhere. In some sense, building the temple is creating the spiritual Garden of Eden. And that's the first step to recreate the Garden of Eden. And then the holiness of the Garden of Eden could spread from the temple to the rest of the world, right? So the temple represents the first step of recreating the Garden of Eden. Okay, this explains, according to the Kabbalists, why we have 7 days of inauguration. Now, 7 days of inauguration is not that telling, but in Hebrew, it's called Shivat Yemei HaMiluim, 7 days of inauguration, but Limale means to fill up. 7 days of filling up. What does it mean, fill up? It means when somebody starts something new, you want to give them, you want to pack them in with excitement, and therefore you make a ball, you make a party, or in general, it's the beginning, it's excitement, so it's full. Those days are full, and you hope that the fullness of the beginning will spread to the future as well. But the Kabbalists say literally, the term 7 days of miluim means 7 days of refilling. What are we refilling? We're refilling the damage that was done in the original 7 days of creation. Because when the whole world was created in 6 days, Adam and Eve sin, that makes out what the Kabbalists call a pagam. It's a deficiency in the 7 days. And if the deficiency of the 7 days is corrected, it's going to be corrected when we build the temple, when we build the temple, both literal temple and metaphoric temple. We're creating a haven of spirituality in our life, which is like the Garden of Eden. And therefore, it can happen after the 7 days because you have to refill the first 7 days. Then you get to the 8th day. What's the 8th day? On the 8th day now, man is complete. Man is back in the temple. Who's back in the Garden of Eden? Who's man? So the Kabbalists say, Aaron, the high priest, is the correction of Adam, the first man. Right? So Adam, the high priest, now goes into the temple. It's like man going back to the Garden of Eden. And again, now the purpose is to spread the light to the whole world. We're first to make a pocket of holiness in the Garden of Eden in the temple, and then it spreads to everybody's table, and then it spreads to everybody's life. Okay, what do we know about the Garden of Eden? Adam and Eve, God placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And what did God tell Adam and Eve to do? What were they sitting, reading the New York Times? What did they do? What was the one mitzvah they had? It's funny to think about it. But the one mitzvah that they had was to what? Was to eat. I know you're thinking the mitzvah not to eat. No, the mitzvah, the verse says, God places Adam and Eve in the garden and says, you should eat of all the fruits in the garden. And then in the next verse, he says, oh yeah, there's one tree, the fruit of one tree you should not eat from, the fruit of the tree of knowledge. But before that, there's a commandment. The commandment says, you should eat of all the fruit of the trees. So Adam and Eve are placed in the Garden of Eden and told what? Eat. Why eat? That's what food is.
Is it you may eat or you should eat?
Very good question. And in Hebrew, it's the same word. So I don't know. I don't know. In Hebrew, you can and you should is the same word. So if you want to insist that it means you may, I'm okay with that. But the Kabbalists say, at least spiritually, it's written in a way, because God could have just said, do not eat of one fruit of the fruit of one tree. Could have just said that, and then you would deduce that you could eat of everything else. But there's a verse that says, of all the fruit of the tree, you may or you can. It doesn't really matter. It's the same word. But the point is, God specifically says, you should be eating now. You may, you could, you're allowed to, you should. That's already the detail. But God could have said, if the purpose was just not to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge, it could have just said, do not eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Instead, it says, eat of all the fruit of the trees. Oh, except for one. So the Kabbalists say, what do you do in the Garden of Eden? You eat. What is eating? Eating is elevating the world. So now, when we get to our Parsha, the Kabbalists say, you know what our Parsha is? Our Parsha is the first step to correct Genesis. So what does our Parsha read? You have Adam. You have Aaron who's correcting Adam. You have the temple, which is sort of the Garden of Eden. And then what do you have? You have how to eat. Right? So we're coming full circle. We're going back to the Garden of Eden. So again, these are the 2 points of the connection at the end of the Parsha. Just to summarize quickly, spent way too much time on this. Summarize quickly. The first point was that the first half of the Parsha discusses the inauguration of a temple, but the second half of the Parsha talks about the temple that we have in each of our lives. And what is that? That's the food we eat. Because when we eat, we elevate the physical and make it spiritual. We just have to make sure that the energy we're getting from the food, we're actually directing towards something spiritual, and that's how it becomes an altar. And the second idea is a little bit more lofty, a little bit more poetic, and that is it's the recreation of the Garden of Eden. We correct the first 7 days. We create a haven, which is like the Garden of Eden, which hopefully then will spread to the rest of the world. And therefore, just like the first thing God tells Adam is how you should eat, and Jill is right. Some things you may eat, some things you may not eat. Same thing in this parsha. Right away, God is saying some foods you could eat, some foods you cannot eat. It's supposed to recreate the feeling of the Garden of Eden. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the general idea of connecting the beginning of the parsha to the end of the parsha. Now we could start getting into the specifics of the drama. Okay, let's see if we can get parsha text. So in the beginning of the parsha, beginning of the portion, we read about the 8th day, and I'm just going to read a verse or two, but before we read it, God tells, Moshe tells his brother Aaron, these are the offerings that Aaron should offer, and these are the offerings that the Jewish people should offer, and that's going to sort of trigger the revelation of God's presence. Now, we can get into the commentaries explain what's the significance of each of these animals. We're not going to do every single one, we'll just do one or two. And again, the point here is to show how the deeper meaning behind what these animals represent, but also the point is to show how we too can bring God into our life, but first we have to offer these offerings, not necessarily physically, but certainly metaphorically. So let's read beginning of the Parsha, Leviticus chapter 9, verse 1, and it was on the 8th day that Moses summoned Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel, and he said to Aaron, take for yourself a bull calf as a sin offering, and a ram and a burnt offering, both unblemished, and bring them near before the Lord. So Aaron has to bring different offerings, but let's focus on the sin offering. What's Aaron's sin offering? A calf. Wonderful. And the children of Israel you shall speak, saying, take a he-goat as a sin offering, and a calf and a lamb, both in their first year, and both unblemished as a burnt offering. So we're going to spend a minute or two thinking about the sin offerings. The other offerings, okay, you want to come close to God, but it seems like there's a sin that Aaron has to deal with, and then there's a separate sin that the Jewish people have to deal with. And the idea here is, if you want God to come into your house, you first have to clean up. If you want to bring God into the Jewish people, we first have to atone for the sins that are blocking the divine presence from entering our life. So the question is, what do these sins represent? So Aaron, take for yourself a Egel ben Bakar. Egel is a calf. Literally, it's the calf, the son of a bull. They translate this as a bull calf. Okay, fine. So we have a young calf. Now, when I tell you the words young calf, what do you think of? What do you think about? The golden calf. Because if you remember the story in the second book of the Torah, in the book of Exodus, Aaron, for whatever reason, and we could send and defend him all day long, but in some sense, Aaron was responsible for the construction of the golden calf. He did it for a good reason. He tried to slow the people down. We're not going to get into that discussion. But what's clear is that Aaron is at the crime scene, and Aaron is actually the one who constructed the golden calf. So the sages say, take for yourself a calf as a sin offering to atone for the golden calf. Okay, fine. The Jewish people, they don't have to atone for the golden calf for whatever reason. That's not their main sin. They sinned because Aaron made it. They have a bigger problem. What's the Jewish people's problem? What do they have to atone for? Verse 3, and to the children of Israel you shall speak, saying, take a he-goat as a sin offering. So a he-goat as a sin offering. What is goat? If you think about the Torah up to this point, what sin was associated with the goat that the Jewish people were involved in? This is a very hard question.
It's not hard. It's Joseph and selling of Joseph and blaming and taking.
The reason why I said, Vicky is right. The reason why I said it's hard because it's not really the sin. It's more the cover-up. It's the cover-up of the sin. But we all know that the cover-up is worse than the crime. That's the way it always works. So if you look at the story of Joseph, the brothers the 10 brothers kidnap Joseph. They decide they're going to sell him as a slave, and they do so. And then they realize, oh, we're in trouble. We have to go back to our father. What are we going to tell our father? So they say, you know what? We have to slaughter the goat. Let's slaughter a goat. We'll dip Joseph's tunic in the blood. We'll send it to our father and say, we found this tunic. Is it your son's? And that's exactly what happened. The father sees the blood on the tunic, and he says, oh, this is the tunic of my son. My son has been devoured by a wild beast. And that's the cover-up. So the sages say, I'm sorry?
There's okay. There's the other the offering of the ram instead of Isaac. It's the
ram. That's not a goat. That's not a goat.
Well, that's a ram and a goat are sort of the same kind of animal.
Yeah, one is an adult. Later they're going to see they offered a ram, but not as a sin offering, as an elevation offering.
Okay,
that's a good connection, because the Akedah is also sort of was called an elevation offering. But we see here that there's a sin that the Jewish people have to deal with, and the sages make a big deal about this, and I think it's fascinating. The Jewish people sinned against God, and now they say, God, we're sorry. Let's reconcile. Let's go on. Let's build a temple. You come and you want to dwell amongst us. So what does God say? No problem. I'm coming. But before we do so, you have to make sure that you atone for the sin of Joseph. What does the sin of Joseph means? The separation between the brothers, right? So I know generations before, the story of Joseph happened generations before, but the concept, the ability, the idea that a brother can sell a brother as a slave, or a brother doesn't love his brother, that would block the divine presence from resting amongst the people. There's a beautiful prayer that we say every day, 3 times a day. It says, Barcheinu Avinu Kulanu K'echad. Bless us, our Father, all of us as one. And the Kabbalists say, it's not only that we're saying, bless us, bless all of us as one. No, bless us, our Father, all of us as one. The only way we can be blessed is if we're as one. And this is what the sages say. They say that blessing is like rain, but it's not enough to have rain. You also need a vessel to catch the water. And the vessel is the peace between people. Shalom. And God did not, there's no other vessel that can contain God's blessing other than peace. So if there's infighting between the people, then even if God is showering the blessings, we can't capture the blessings. So in other words, before we can expect to become a vessel to the divine presence, to the holiness in our life, we have to go back and fix the sale of Joseph. Even though these people here didn't sell Joseph, it was their ancestors. But the attitude that could lead to the sale of Joseph has to be corrected and uprooted and atoned for. And that, I think, is a beautiful idea, because it tells us that it's not just about the relationship with people and God, but God says, before I could dwell amongst the people, it's the people themselves have to learn how to make peace and create the reconciliation within themselves before they could hope for the parent, so to speak, for the God to enter and dwell in their midst. So that's also an important lesson. And if you're a parent and you have more than one child and they fight, you know that that's a big problem. You can't really, it doesn't let you live in peace if your kids are fighting with each other. And that's really what God is saying. You have to atone for the sale of Joseph before you can get the divine presence. Okay, so that's another detail. Go ahead.
I just want to point out, maybe it's another connection between the beginning and the end of the Parsha, because it kind of creates an arc, and Hashem commands what species you should offer, what species you should eat or not eat, and the importance of following commandment and consequences if you don't.
That's good. Yeah. So in other words, the offerings in the beginning of the Parsha are like the animals that may be eaten toward the end. Okay, that's good.
And then this idea of us creating the peace before God brings his greater peace is sort of like the 7 and 8 again, us doing our part before God.
Very good. Everything is coming together like a puzzle. That means the interpretations are accurate, right? If everything comes together and things start clicking, then you see that because the truth is interrelated. So if something is true, it has to be consistent. It has to be interrelated. Yes, very good. Okay, now we get to the big drama, and there's so many ways of reading the story, and there's so many takeaways, but we'll go straight to the drama. It's short, just a few verses, but it is the idea of the two sons of Aaron. I'm going to read it inside just to get the actual feeling for what happens here. And maybe we'll read some Rashi and see what's taking place here. So verse 24 represents the idea of the culmination after all those 7 days of inauguration, and after Aaron offering his offerings and offering offerings on behalf of the people, finally the divine presence rests. How does the divine presence rest? Where do you see it? So verse 24 is this sort of the place where the Jewish people can see it, the tangible miracle that takes place that represents to the people the idea that God is dwelling in the temple. So if you look at 24, and fire went forth from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offerings and the fats upon the altar, and all the people saw, sang praises, and fell upon their faces. So Rina, Vayaronu, they translate this as sing praises, but Rina is one of the expressions of joy in Judaism, in Hebrew. There's a blessing where we say at the wedding, and at the wedding we mention 10 expressions of joy. It's really 8, but Chatan Kala, bride and groom, was counted in the 10. I'm pretty sure. 10 expressions. No, 10 expressions of joy and peace and brotherhood. It's almost 10 of joy. One of them is Rina. There's Sason, Simcha, Gila, Rina, Ditza, Chedva. So there's at least 8 expressions of joy. One of them is that's Hebrew for you, right? Different languages have expertise in expressing different things. Hebrew is very good at emotion. So you have at least 8 different words for joy because there are different shades of joy. So one of them is Rina, and that's the word right here. The people saw and sang praises, but they rejoiced. So my point here is it's obviously a very happy occasion. What happens right after that? Everybody's like, wow, the divine presence dwells. So what does everyone do? Everyone falls on their faces. Falling on their faces is bowing. It's a sign of awe. What's the next step? Everybody is in awe, except for who? Except for the 2 sons of Aaron. They see the fire and they run inside. And Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, each took his pan, put fire in them, and placed incense upon it. And they brought before the Lord foreign fire, which he had not commanded them. And fire went forth from before the Lord and consumed them. Very interesting. The same exact expression that you get in 24 that represents the God dwelling in the temple, which is sort of the culmination of the day. And fire went forth from before the Lord. That same expression is used with the death of the 2 sons of Aaron, which is significant. And fire went forth from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean, is the Torah trying to indicate that it's good or they're bad? Are they good people or bad people? So let's read the next verse. Verse 3. Then Moses said to Aaron, this is what the Lord spoke when he said, I will be sanctified through those near to me. And before all the people, I will be glorified. And Aaron was silent. So without getting into what Moses exactly means here, but what you see here, Moses says, I will be sanctified. God says, I'm going to be sanctified through those near to me. In other words, Moses tells Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, the 2 sons of Aaron, are near God. They're the ones nearest to God. They are closest to God. So this leads the sages to everybody says they are holy and spiritual people. Yet they die. But they're still very holy and very spiritual people. So the sin is it's a sin that comes from a good place, so to speak. And there's all kinds of ways of discussing this, of what exactly it means. I'll tell you what the classic Hasidic interpretation, there's so many ways of doing this. They all have a common theme. And the common theme is that, according to the Kabbalah, they run too close to God. They have a desire to connect to God. They don't want to be in this world. They run inside. They're hoping to die. So the punishment is not really, it's a punishment. It's not really a punishment because that's what they want. The soul wants to expire from the body. And therefore, if you look at the sages offer all kinds of reasons of what was their underlying sin, because they went inside, that's a reason to die. So the sages give all kinds of interpretations. They say, well, they didn't want to marry, or they didn't want to have children. And what all these interpretations have in common is their sin was they wanted to be too spiritual. They wanted to go into the temple and not leave. In the language of the Kabbalah, they had ratso. They wanted to run, but they didn't want to return. And in our relationship with God, you have to run. You have to create a love to God and a desire to transcend and become spiritual. But God doesn't want you to stay in a temple being spiritual. God wants you to return to bring that inspiration back to daily life and what? And eat. But eat is a metaphor to elevate the rest of the world. So their sin, according to the Kabbalists, is they're running and they're not returning. And what's the punishment? The punishment is, it's not really a punishment. It's exactly what they wanted, but it's a sin because it's not consistent with the divine will. This is one point. I have a lot more to say about this, but first I want to hear what Jill says. Go ahead, Jill.
Okay, Rabbi, this is congruent with the job that Moses was trying to do at creating a people. He can't let people go off and offer sacrifices. He cannot. There has to be a kind of unified command.
Yes.
And everybody going off and having their own spiritual experiences at this point in our history would have been very deleterious. So this is congruent with everything you said, because this is showing that this is not the way to go.
Right.
If we're going to build a tribe.
We have a one path to God. You can't go make. The Torah emphasizes, just supports Jill's point. The Torah emphasizes that it was a foreign fire, which they have not been commanded, which means that essentially there's nothing wrong with the fire. The only problem is that they have not been commanded, right? So they offered a foreign fire. What does a foreign fire mean? Which he had not commanded them. That's the definition of foreign fire. Why is it a problem? Because you have not been commanded. And basically, Jill is saying that the lesson here is that if you want to come close to God, you have to follow the path prescribed in the Torah, at least at that point. Okay, that's good. As I alluded to, there's so many other interpretations. I'll give you one more. One more interpretation is like this. The problem with the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and it's a problem when you get too close. The problem is not if they offer the fire outside. The problem is, it says, they brought before the Lord. In other words, they went inside. They came before the Lord. They went into the temple. And the sages say they actually went into this Holy of Holies. So this is a problem that you run into only when you go into the Holy of Holies. And this is what the sages say is that you need, what the Kabbalists say is the danger of having unbridled love, too much love without the balance of awe, or what we would call respect. In other words, if you think about it, we'll think about it in a human relationship and then apply it to God, but because it's really the same concept applies. If you think about it, when a person is really in love with somebody and you really want to become close to somebody, so there's a danger. The danger is, I'm so close to you, I want you to be just like me. I don't really respect your perspective. We want to become one. And the closer I get to you, the closer you let me into your life, the more respect I have to have for you, the more I have to respect your vulnerabilities, the more I have to respect your own perspective. Because if there's somebody that's not so close to you and they don't respect you, that's not as hurtful. But if you let somebody very close to you into your life and they love you so much, but they love you so much that they say, well, I love you so much I can scream at you because I love you, right? No, it doesn't work that way. So the lesson here is that you have to have the balance of love and respect. And like I said a moment ago, if you look at the verses, you see that the people saw the fire, they felt the fire, they felt the inspiration, they sang praises, by Arona, they were joyous, which represents the idea that they feel the love, yet they fall on their faces, they also have respect. The two sons of Aaron, on the other hand, don't respect the boundaries in the sense they don't respect that you can't come too close to God. You have to respect the difference between the human being and God. So both in the human relationship and with the relationship with God, you need both feelings of both emotions, the balance of love and respect. And if you have just love and no respect, it may seem exciting and may seem fulfilling, but ultimately the fire, the passion of the love is going to consume the relationship. It's going to destroy, because you must have the boundary of respect. And it's true within people, but how much more so true within God. And again, when I talked about before, the idea of running without returning. Why do I run? I run because I love God. Why do I return? Not because I want to return. Why do I come back to this world? Not because I want to return, because I respect that that is God's will, right? So I'm moving away. Why am I moving away? Because that's what God wants, right? So you have to create boundaries. I love my child so much, so I want them to do exactly what I want. No, you have to, so ultimately, if you don't want to suffocate them, you have to create the boundary. You have to step back. That's the return. And the return takes respect. And respect is very difficult when you feel intense love. But nevertheless, this powerful story represents the urge of the lover to just feel love and run too close and not respect the other person. What does the other person need at this moment? He may not need this closeness. Maybe this closeness now will be too painful. And that's and it's certainly true with God. I love God. I want to come close to God. But what does God want? It's not about me. It's about the relationship. What does God want? God doesn't want me to escape like the sons of Aaron and my soul to expire. God wants me to be in this world and involved and invested in the material world to elevate the material world. I may not want to do that, but I respect that that's God's will. So the life of the spiritual seeker is the tension between the running and returning. And the running and returning, in other words, is the love and respect. Love is the desire to escape and become close to God. And respect is the understanding that I have to take a step away. It's not about doing what I want, coming one with God. I have to respect the differences and God's perspective and what God wants of me. And like I said, this concept is true both in the human relationships and with the relationship with God. The only difference is there's no difference. It's going to destroy the relationship. Just love with no respect is going to destroy the relationship with God and with another person. The only difference is with Nadav and Avihu, they also died physically because that's what they wanted. But the idea that the fire will consume, and now the fire, which was so powerful and could be harnessed to do so much good, actually can be destructive. That's true about love as well. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is a big idea. We can elaborate upon this, but I think it's important at least to think about this and think about the story in that light, because again, the takeaway is profound. We wake up in the morning and we create the running. We say the Shema. What is the second sentence of the Shema? God is one. There's nothing else that's significant. That's the first sentence. What's the second sentence? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. That represents the running. I want to escape. Then what do you say? Oh, and these words, the Torah, you should apply it when you go on the road, when you're in your home, when you go inside, when you go outside. In modern English, you would say when you go to work. Right? So capture that feeling, that intense love to God, but take that with you wherever you go in the world. That's the return. Don't be like the sons of Aaron. Don't just run into the Holy of Holies saying, I want to become with God. Understand the respect that you want God's perspective, and God's perspective is that you take that inspiration to the rest of the world. So this is the story in short. Thank you for joining. It's wonderful to be back. Comments, questions, please share. And otherwise, have a wonderful day, and everybody should feel good. And good to see everybody. And I see Michelle here. I think she's in Florida now, I think. So welcome back. Wonderful. Good to see everybody. Yes, go ahead, Vicky.
Yeah, I had a question. So from the Aaron's son's perspective, it's just not just disrespect of God's will, but also the holiest place, the representation of God's will on this earth. So this connects to the Haftorah. So, hi, Isaac.
Hi.
So the